In February of 1942, inside a fortified tunnel on the besieged island of Corregidor, General Douglas MacArthur received an order from President Franklin Roosevelt that placed him in one of the most difficult positions of his entire military career. Leave the Philippines. Leave the men under his command who were slowly starving and running out of ammunition on the Bataan Peninsula, and travel to Australia to take command of the broader Pacific theater. MacArthur's first instinct, according to multiple accounts from officers present with him at the time, was to refuse, to resign his commission and remain in the Philippines to fight, and if necessary, die, alongside the men he had commanded through months of increasingly hopeless defense. What he actually did instead, in the days and hours before his eventual departure, and the promise he made upon reaching safety in Australia, would define both his public reputation and his personal obsession for the remainder of the entire Pacific War. This is the story of what MacArthur did the day he was ordered to abandon the Philippines, and how a single, hastily written sentence became one of the most consequential personal commitments any American general made during the entire war. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How does a commander reconcile a direct order to save himself with the knowledge that the men he is leaving behind are almost certainly walking into captivity, starvation, or death? MacArthur had commanded American and Filipino forces in the Philippines since well before the war began, having previously served as a military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth government during the years leading up to the Japanese invasion, a role that gave him a personal and professional investment in the island's defense that went considerably beyond the ordinary command relationship a general might have with a theater he had only recently been assigned to. This deep personal connection to the Philippines and its people, built over years of pre-war service, added a further layer of emotional weight to the eventual decision to leave, since MacArthur was not simply abandoning a military command post, but a country and a population he had genuine personal and professional ties to extending back more than a decade. It is worth pausing on the sheer scale of what the Bataan and Corregidor defenders had actually accomplished before their eventual surrender, since the prolonged, months-long resistance these forces mounted, however ultimately unsuccessful, had already delayed Japanese offensive timetables elsewhere in the Pacific and inflicted losses on Japanese forces considerably beyond what a more rapid capitulation would have produced. A strategic contribution that provides important context for understanding why Washington placed such value on preserving MacArthur's leadership for the broader campaigns still to come, even as it required abandoning the specific forces whose sacrifice had already bought valuable time. By February of 1942, the American and Filipino defense of the Philippines had been reduced to two final desperate strongholds: the Bataan Peninsula, where exhausted and severely undersupplied troops continued fighting a grinding defensive campaign against Japanese forces, and the fortress island of Corregidor at the entrance to Manila Bay, where MacArthur had established his command headquarters inside the reinforced Malinta Tunnel. The strategic situation had been deteriorating for months, with promised reinforcement and resupply from the United States never materializing at anything close to the scale the besieged garrison actually needed, leaving MacArthur's forces to fight an increasingly hopeless defensive campaign against a Japanese army that continued receiving fresh troops and supplies even as American and Filipino forces grew progressively weaker. President Roosevelt's decision to order MacArthur out of the Philippines reflected a calculation made at the highest levels of American strategic planning, a recognition that MacArthur's capture or death would represent both a devastating propaganda victory for Japan and the loss of an experienced senior commander whose leadership Roosevelt and his military advisors believed would prove essential to the broader Pacific War effort still to come. This calculation placed MacArthur's personal survival and continued command ahead of any consideration of remaining with the specific forces currently under siege. a strategic logic that made sense from Washington's broader perspective, but that placed MacArthur himself in a genuinely difficult moral and professional position. The broader strategic situation facing American planners in early 1942 extended well beyond the Philippines alone. Since Washington was simultaneously managing the shock of Pearl Harbor's aftermath, the rapid Japanese advance across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and the urgent need to organize a coherent defensive and eventual offensive strategy across an enormous theater with limited immediately available resources. A broader context that shaped Roosevelt's calculation about MacArthur's value as a symbol of continued resistance and a proven commander whose leadership would be needed for the far larger campaign still ahead, rather than a resource to be risked in a single, already largely determined defensive engagement. MacArthur's initial reaction to the order, according to accounts from staff officers present with him in the days following its arrival, involved serious and apparently sincere consideration of refusing the order entirely, a response that reflected both his own personal sense of obligation to the men he commanded and a genuine concern about how his departure would be perceived by the troops he was leaving behind to face almost certain capture or death. Several accounts describe MacArthur drafting, or at least seriously discussing, a formal resignation of his military commission, specifically so that he could remain in the Philippines as a private citizen rather than comply with an order he found personally and professionally agonizing to accept. MacArthur's staff officers making this argument to him reportedly pointed specifically to the propaganda and morale value his continued survival and eventual return would provide, both to American forces still fighting across the Pacific and to the Filipino population itself, arguing that a MacArthur who escaped to fight another day preserved genuine strategic and symbolic value, that a MacArthur who died or was captured on Corregidor simply could not provide, however honorable that alternative outcome might have appeared in the moment. It was ultimately a combination of direct pressure from his own senior staff officers, who argued forcefully that his continued leadership was needed for the broader war effort, and that a heroic but strategically pointless death or capture would serve no one, and, ultimately, his own recognition that a direct presidential order could not simply be refused by a serving officer, that led MacArthur to accept the evacuation, however reluctantly. This decision-making process, stretched across several tense days, reflected a genuine internal conflict between personal loyalty to his besieged command and professional obligation to follow lawful orders from his commander-in-chief. President Manuel Quezon of the Philippine Commonwealth, whose own government had been operating alongside MacArthur's military command through the siege, faced a parallel and equally difficult decision about his own evacuation during this same period, ultimately also departing the islands for the United States. A coordinated set of departures by the island's senior political and military leadership that, while strategically justified from Washington's perspective, added to the sense of abandonment some Filipino civilians and soldiers reportedly experienced as their government and military leadership prepared to leave the archipelago to its fate under continuing Japanese assault. Stop and consider what the actual evacuation demanded of MacArthur and the small group traveling with him, because the journey itself carried genuine and serious risk, quite apart from the emotional difficulty of the decision to leave at all. On the night of March 11, 1942, MacArthur, his wife Jean, their young son Arthur, and a small group of senior staff officers boarded a flotilla of PT boats commanded by Lieutenant John Bulkley, a journey that required navigating hundreds of miles through waters actively patrolled by Japanese naval forces, in small, fast but lightly armed vessels that offered little protection if they encountered a Japanese warship along the route. Lieutenant John Bulkley, commanding the small flotilla of PT boats that carried MacArthur's party, had already established a reputation for aggressive, skilled small boat operations against Japanese naval forces earlier in the Philippines campaign, a reputation that reportedly factored directly into the decision to entrust him with an evacuation mission of this significance, since the operation demanded exactly the combination of navigational skill, tactical judgment, and calm decision-making under pressure that Bulkley had already demonstrated in previous engagements against Japanese shipping in the same general waters. The PT boat journey to Mindanao, conducted primarily under cover of darkness, specifically to reduce the risk of detection, brought MacArthur's party through genuinely dangerous waters over the course of several days, a voyage several participants later described as carrying real uncertainty about whether the group would actually reach safety at all, given how thoroughly Japanese forces controlled the surrounding seas by this stage of the Philippines campaign. The specific physical toll of the journey itself, undertaken aboard small, fast boats offering minimal shelter from ocean spray and rough seas over an extended multi-day voyage, proved genuinely difficult, even for the physically fit members of MacArthur's party, and accounts from those present describe considerable seasickness and exhaustion among the group by the time they finally reached Mindanao, a physically grueling ordeal that added a further layer of difficulty to what was already an emotionally and professionally fraught departure from the Philippines. From Mindanao, MacArthur and his party continued by B-17 bomber to Australia, completing an evacuation that had demanded genuine physical courage and endurance from everyone involved, regardless of the more complicated questions surrounding the political and moral dimensions of leaving the besieged garrison behind. General Wainwright himself, assuming overall command of the remaining Philippines defense once MacArthur departed, faced an extraordinarily difficult command situation, with no realistic prospect of resupply or reinforcement, and a rapidly deteriorating position on both Bataan and Corregidor. A command responsibility he carried through the campaign's final, catastrophic weeks, with what several historians studying his conduct during this period have described as genuine skill and personal courage under circumstances that offered him almost no realistic path to a successful outcome, regardless of what tactical decisions he made. For the American and Filipino forces remaining under General Jonathan Wainwright's command after MacArthur's departure, the weeks that followed brought exactly the outcome MacArthur's own initial resistance to evacuation had anticipated. Bataan fell in early April of 1942, its starving, exhausted defenders forced into surrender, and the brutal death march this channel has covered in an earlier episode. A march that killed thousands of the very men MacArthur had commanded and then left behind under presidential order. Corregidor itself held out for several additional weeks before finally surrendering in May, with Wainwright himself becoming a Japanese prisoner of war for the remainder of the conflict, enduring years of captivity before his eventual liberation and presence at Japan's formal surrender ceremony in September of 1945. It is worth noting, in fairness to MacArthur's own position, that he had strongly and repeatedly requested additional reinforcement and resupply for the Philippines garrison in the months before his departure. Appeals to Washington that went largely unanswered, given the broader strategic priorities and resource limitations facing American military planning in the war's opening months. Meaning MacArthur himself bore direct, personal frustration over the same abandonment of adequate support that his own departure would later come to symbolize for many of the men left behind, a frustration that several historians studying his wartime correspondence have documented in considerable detail. The gap between MacArthur's safe evacuation and the catastrophic fate that awaited the men he left behind produced genuine and lasting resentment among a portion of the Bataan and Corregidor survivors, some of whom, in post-war accounts and interviews, expressed bitterness at what they perceived as MacArthur escaping to safety, while ordinary soldiers paid the price of continued resistance. A criticism that has remained a persistent and contested element of MacArthur's wartime reputation ever since, even as historians studying the broader strategic context have generally concluded that MacArthur's evacuation reflected legitimate presidential orders, rather than any personal choice to abandon his command. MacArthur's arrival in Australia itself, and the reception he received from Australian officials, and the broader Allied command structure in the Southwest Pacific Theater, reflected the genuine strategic value Washington had placed on securing his continued leadership, with MacArthur quickly assuming command responsibilities across a theater considerably larger and, in terms of available resources, considerably better positioned than the besieged Philippines garrison he had just left, a command transition that, whatever the emotional difficulty of the departure itself, placed him in a position to actually exercise the kind of strategic influence over the broader war effort that his continued presence in a doomed Philippines defense could never have provided. Upon reaching Australia and safety, MacArthur delivered a public statement that would become one of the most famous and consequential personal declarations of the entire Pacific War, telling reporters, and, through them, the American public and the men he had left behind in the Philippines, a promise phrased in terms that emphasized his own personal commitment: "I came through, and I shall return." This statement, quickly shortened in public memory to the simpler and more famous phrase, "I shall return," carried enormous immediate propaganda value, providing both American forces still fighting in the Philippines and the broader American public with a symbol of eventual liberation and continued resistance at a moment when the news from the Pacific had been almost uniformly catastrophic. American war correspondents present when MacArthur delivered his statement reportedly recognized immediately the powerful propaganda and morale value the phrase carried, and the promise was rapidly disseminated through American newspapers and radio broadcasts, transforming what had begun as a private, personally fraught departure from a doomed command into a widely publicized symbol of American resolve and eventual return, a transformation that MacArthur himself, given his well-documented understanding of and attention to public perception throughout his career, almost certainly anticipated and, according to several biographers, deliberately cultivated through the specific wording he chose. The statement also drew immediate and, in the decades since, persistent criticism for its specifically personal phrasing, using "I" rather than "we," in a way several contemporaries and later historians have argued, reflected MacArthur's genuine and well-documented tendency toward self-promotion and personal branding, even in a moment of genuine national crisis, when a more collective framing might have better served the broader war effort and the men still fighting and dying in the Philippines, under Wainwright's command. The specific strategic debate over whether to prioritize the Philippines or bypass it entirely in favor of a more direct route toward Japan through Formosa involved genuine and serious disagreement among senior American military leadership, with Admiral Chester Nimitz and several naval planners preferring the more direct approach on straightforward strategic and logistical grounds, while MacArthur argued forcefully, both on stated strategic grounds regarding the moral obligation to liberate the Filipino people, and, some historians have suggested, on the basis of his own deeply personal investment in fulfilling his public promise, that the Philippines campaign needed to proceed as a full liberation rather than being bypassed. MacArthur's promise became, over the following 2.5 years, a defining and, according to many historians who have studied his wartime decision-making, genuinely obsessive personal commitment that shaped major strategic decisions throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Most significantly, his insistence on liberating the Philippines directly through a major amphibious campaign rather than accepting an alternative strategic approach some naval planners preferred, which would have bypassed the islands entirely in favor of a more direct advance toward Japan through Formosa. Biographer William Manchester, whose extensive study of MacArthur's life and career remains one of the most detailed and widely read examinations of his wartime decision-making, presented this specific tension between genuine strategic judgment and personal, image-conscious motivation as a defining and recurring pattern throughout MacArthur's entire military career, arguing that the two impulses were rarely fully separable in MacArthur's own thinking, a psychological complexity that makes any simple, one-dimensional assessment of his conduct during the Philippines evacuation and subsequent campaign considerably more difficult than either his most ardent admirers or harshest critics have sometimes suggested. Historians examining this strategic debate have continued to disagree about how much MacArthur's personal promise, as opposed to genuine strategic considerations, drove his insistence on the Philippines campaign specifically, a debate that reflects the broader difficulty of separating MacArthur's authentic strategic judgment from his well-documented concern for his own public image and legacy throughout his military career. The eventual decision to proceed with the full Philippines campaign, made at the highest levels of American strategic planning, following extensive debate between the competing approaches, reflected a combination of MacArthur's forceful advocacy, genuine strategic considerations regarding the value of Philippine bases and the moral weight of the commitment already made to the Filipino population, and broader political considerations about American credibility in the region, a decision whose full strategic wisdom historians continue to debate even today, separate from the question of MacArthur's personal motivations in advocating for it so forcefully. MacArthur fulfilled his promise in October of 1944, wading ashore at Leyte in a carefully staged and widely photographed moment that consciously echoed and fulfilled the exact language of his 1942 statement, declaring to the Filipino people and the world that he had, indeed, returned as promised. This moment, and the broader liberation campaign that followed, provided MacArthur with the kind of personally validating vindication few military commanders ever achieve so directly and publicly, closing a loop that had begun with his difficult, reluctant departure from Corregidor 2.5 years earlier. The Leyte landing itself, restaging elements of the March 1942 departure in reverse, and consciously choreographed for maximum photographic and propaganda impact, produced one of the most widely reproduced images of the entire Pacific War. MacArthur wading through the shallow water toward the beach in a moment that photographers and MacArthur's own staff had carefully arranged to capture, an image that, much like his original evacuation, blended genuine historical significance with MacArthur's characteristic and well-documented attention to how the moment would be recorded and remembered by history. MacArthur was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his defense of the Philippines, a decoration that several historians studying the decision have suggested was motivated at least partly by political and propaganda considerations, an effort to counter the persistent criticism of his evacuation by providing clear, official recognition of his service, rather than reflecting an uncontested consensus about the specific military merit of his conduct during the campaign's final defensive phase. Remember the question this story opened with. How does a commander reconcile a direct order to save himself with the knowledge that the men he is leaving behind are almost certainly walking into captivity, starvation, or death? MacArthur's own answer, reconstructed through the documented record of his agonized initial resistance, his eventual compliance under both direct order and staff pressure, and the very personal promise he made upon reaching safety, suggests he never fully reconciled it at all. He accepted the order because he had no legitimate choice but to accept it, and he spent the following 2.5 years converting a departure he had never wanted to make into a debt he was determined to repay, whatever the strategic debates that decision would later provoke. If you want to understand the genuine internal conflict MacArthur faced when ordered to leave the men under his command, the dangerous journey that actually got him to safety, and how a single sentence spoken upon his arrival in Australia came to define his entire remaining approach to the Pacific War, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.